about things to reflect on, does this actually make any sense?
It's interesting. I think we're going to have to define what makes something make sense, because what you're saying makes sense to me in a very stable society where we have a way to quarantine people. But again, I look at everything from an evolutionary perspective. Now, whether the following stat is accurate or just directionally correct, I heard that roughly 80% of people in the Navy SEALs score very high on the psychopathy scale, if I'm not mistaken. And that's because, from an evolutionary standpoint, you need people that can kill just without remorse, because you lived an insanely dangerous world where there were people that were coming to kill you. They did not think of you as human. You were other. They were going to take everything you owned. They were going to take your women. They were going to rape them. They were going to kill you. Like, very bad things happen on an evolutionary timescale. It is just a litany of tragedy and horror. And, you know, obviously right now there are two hot wars going on that I'm aware of, maybe more. Uh, October 7th was a level of horror that was just startling to behold. And so it's like, oh yeah, humans really are capable of just an insane level of violence and dehumanization. And so when you say it doesn't make sense, it's like, it feels like maybe in this current time, in this country, it doesn't make sense. But I get why, from an evolutionary perspective, it was selected for. How do you think about that?
Well, one of the great sort of bugaboos about sort of evolution and sort of the first decades of social Darwinists saying what is what was meant to be, and sort of naturalistic fallacy, all of that, is this notion that what evolution rewards is aggression and domination and passing on more copies of your genes. And a lot of what both evolutionary biologists who like sit there and do math modeling, and evolutionary biologists who sit and look at animals, including humans, is, this concept of alternative strategies. Like, there's lots of different ways in which humans succeed and passing on copies of their genes, and baboons. And like, one thing I've seen in my years of studying baboons is the guy who was able to walk away from every stupid provocation instead of getting into a fight. When you look at his whole lifespan, he will have left more copies of his genes than the guy who fights his way to be alpha and is there for 8 months before somebody breaks his arm in a fight. Like, nice guys. Yeah, it's not just nature, bloody tooth and claw, and it's not just that nice guys finish last. One manifestation of that is, like, I am by nature extremely pessimistic, but I have to admit some retrospective optimism. Looking at sort of the Hobbesian picture you painted just now, one of the things that all sorts of nice socialized anthropologists will come to blows about is, when did our ancestors invent warfare? And there's one school of thought that says we have common descent from a shared ancestor of chimps about 6, 7 million years ago. And overwhelmingly, what it shows is our entire history as a species has just been blotched with organized violence and warfare and such. And sort of citing certain contemporary studies of indigenous populations and rates of violence and such, and paleontological records of how often you're finding an arrowhead stuck in somebody's like skull when you dig them up, kind of thing. And then meanwhile, the alternative school is that when you look carefully, there's actually no evidence of organized warfare up until we invented agriculture about 12,000 years ago, up until we became sedentary, up until, either because of agriculture, one notable case where people had the greatest fishing hole on earth in North Kenya about 12,000 years ago and were willing to be violent to defend it. But as soon as you had people become sedentary and start farming and start generating surplus and being able to make things and also having surplus time, you could invent things like a standing military. You could invent things like hating somebody because they've got more stuff than you have. And I'm quite convinced by the evidence suggesting that humans did not invent organized violence until like the last 10, 12,000 years or so. And you look carefully at, say, the anthropological records, looking at contemporary hunter-gatherers and how often they're violent, and overwhelmingly it's built around they are keeping out people who are trying to come in and take their land because they want to like cut down the forest and things like that. Amazonian circumstances. You go through it, and I think the good news is we haven't been a species reflexively organizing into massive violence against each other for all that long of a time. It's a pretty recent invention. That said, what the best evidence suggests is that individual hominins have been killing each other at the same rate in every sort of culture on earth over individual conflict kind of things everywhere you look. When you spend enough time, say, studying Kalahari hunter-gatherers in Botswana, and like if you're studying a band of 30 of these people, you're going to have to watch them for like 55 years running to get enough observations to tell you what their violence rate is like compared to downtown Detroit over the course of a year. But when you get enough of those data, there's basically the same rates of some guy killing some other guy over reproductive access, of some guy killing some woman over a perceived rejection of overtures, of some guy killing some other guy over an honor violation. Yeah, that we've been doing forever. And that proves to be a very tough one. No degree of punishment in the form of a death penalty does much for crimes of passion. Whether you were talking about like an ancestor 2 million years ago, or people in most cultures on earth, including all those nice, swell, heartwarming hunter-gatherers, you come home and you find your loved one in bed with somebody else, and your impulsive crime of passion there is going to be pretty unchangeable by external contingencies of punishment. So that aspect of us, I think, is really, really long lasting. The notion of a whole bunch of hominins coming together and working in a cooperative way with the willingness to have a hierarchy of command to go and try to do damage to somebody else's equivalent group, that's not all that baked into our legacy, I don't think.
Hmm. That's the first time I've heard that. That is very interesting. Now, knowing your own work on chimps, chimps will band together and do patrol parties and raid other chimp groups and kill them off. Um, Given that, that sounds more to me like organized military. It's not exactly a standing army, but it rhymes with it. Um, so, given that we are on that same evolutionary tree, why do you think that we don't have that in our just eternal past?
Well, for a very simple reason. First off, I wish I had had the luck to spend decades with chimps, but I spent them with baboons who are,
Baboon, sorry.
they're not
Yes.
chimps. They don't make tools like that. They're not as smart, but they're plenty interesting when it comes to primates being awful to each other in interesting ways. Um, Well, exactly what you bring up was the driving force on notions of like our demonically violent past, because our closest relative historically was chimps. 6, 7 million years ago, we share 98% of our DNA or so. And yeah, they have organized violence. They kill each other. They kill each other in ways where the males in one group will systematically kill all the males in another group and take over their territory and expand that. And whoa, look at this. We've got this legacy of 6 million years back and all of that. And there's one word that shows how this is not really the case: bonobos. Bonobo chimps, pygmy chimps, they used to be called. Bonobos have a completely different social system. They are female dominated. They have virtually no aggression. Nothing like that has ever been seen in a bonobo. They solve every source of social tension with sex, and sex of every stripe you could imagine. They're totally groovy, all of that. And you look and, oh, we share 98% of our DNA with bonobos as well. They are as close of cousins as chimps are. And even separate of the fact that we're not chimps, we're not bonobos, we solved our own evolutionary selective challenges in a unique way. All of that, we're as closely related to the most groovy pacifists out there in the primate world as we are to murderous demonic chimps. So that does in that one. And some of the most influential writing about our supposed inevitability of violence because of our shared chimp ancestry predated our knowledge about bonobo social behavior and bonobo genetics and what the genome looks like.
Okay, very interesting. It doesn't seem self-evident to me that if we're related to both of them equally, and we are in today's age certainly capable of extreme violence. Look, I may be optimistic where you're pessimistic. I think the vast majority of humans just want to get on with their day and they're loving and kind. But we do have these weird evolutionary quirks that make other people the out group, us the in group. We have envy. So there are things that will then trigger that murderous rage. We are also I'd be very interested to see if there are studies on this, but as an entrepreneur, I will tell you that people crave certainty, and that when you give them certainty, you can get them to follow you, and people are so very malleable. And if you give them something to believe in and then say, hey, but we have to go kill these other people, they'll be here for it if things are bad enough. And you need look no further than the rise of the Third Reich, and anybody unfamiliar with that history is it's just absolutely astonishing. And I am a big believer in what Solzhenitsyn said, which is the line through good and evil runs through every human heart. So when I look at those stories, I go, oh God, I have all those the same ability to be manipulated, to come to just horrifyingly erroneous conclusions. So anyway, bringing it back to the monkeys, given how far off the violent or far off the beaten path to violence that we have proven that we are capable of going, when I look at bonobos who have every groovy flavor of sex, as you were saying, and I look at least in contemporary society, even now, like there's a shame, there is a sense of that needs to be in private. So I don't feel a ton of kinship there. And then with chimps, dominance, aggression, hierarchy, as a guy in business, I will say, yeah, that all sounds pretty familiar. Again, I don't know the studies in the way that you do, so I'd love to know, is there more to that story that shows that no, we're really in alignment with bonobos? And if we are, does that mean that if they had stuff to protect, they had a farm, they could hoard wealth, do you think they too would break bad eventually?
Yeah, which is a great question. I think what you're alluding to with your entrepreneurial self, recognizing the chimp in you, um, is, we're not a chimp, we're not a bonobo. We have been subject to the same evolutionary rules, but came up with a unique solution to a unique set of challenges, but nonetheless, one that can have a lot of overlap with how chimp solved it or bonobo solved it. But what I think is implicit in your statement is we show staggering amounts of variability. We have both, I don't know, Elon Musk and the Dalai Lama, or, whatever. We're an incredibly varied species, and we are simultaneously the most violent species on Earth, but also the most cooperative and altruistic and empathic. And sometimes it could be the same person who embodies both of those behaviors. And sometimes it could be the same behavior. And it's in the eye of the beholder whether this person is a terrorist or a freedom fighter, kind of thing.
You can reboot your life, your health, even your career, anything you want. All you need is discipline. I can teach you the tactics that I learned while growing a billion-dollar business that will allow you to see your goals through. Whether you want better health, stronger relationships, a more successful career, any of that is possible with the mindset and business programs in Impact Theory University. Join the thousands of students who have already accomplished amazing things. Tap now for a free trial and get started today.
So we're a very in the middle confused species with tremendous individual variation. And thus there's an implicit danger to decide that any other species out there is a good model for making sense of how we evolved. And I think one can cherry pick stuff on that. And I guarantee you there's somebody somewhere on some organic farm wearing Birkenstocks or whatever whose natural affinity will be much more with bonobos. Or yeah, we're highly variable in that way. Great example of this. Okay, in primatology, there's this broad classification you can do across like 150 primate species or so. There are species that are monogamous pair bonders, and there are ones who are polygamous polyandrous. Pair bonders, gibbons, siamang, some South American monkeys, and then there's all the apes and most of the old world primates, all of that. So you see these two patterns. And it turns out there's all sorts of traits that go in common with if you turn out to be a pair bonding species or a polygamous species, a tournament species. And these traits play out in remarkable ways. In a species in which males mate with a lot of females, different females, you don't see male parental care because they don't care. In a species in which females are mating with multiple males over the course of their cycle, you don't see male parenting either because there's a high degree of uncertainty. In a species like that, where there's high degrees of aggression, there's selection for secondary sexual characteristics like lots of muscle and sharp canines. And then you look at one of the pair bonding species, and males and females look exactly the same because they've been selected for the same sort of traits, being good parents. And male marmoset monkeys will do more parenting of their offspring than even the females will. And these are two totally different sorts of pictures. Sufficiently so, like you go out in a newly discovered island and there's a new primate nobody has ever seen before, and you manage to see this one way up in that tree is a male. You see his penis, and then magically he falls out of the tree dead, so you've got his body to examine then. And over there's a female because you saw her nursing somebody young and she falls out of the tree, and now you can compare them and you know nothing whatsoever about the species social system. Right off the bat, if the male is a whole lot bigger than the female, you're looking at a tournament species. Right off the bat, if you look at, the length of time the female nurses and how much milk can be stored, you're finding out something about if she's a pair bonding species. And right away, you look at whether females and males have canines. It's a whole bunch of these, nothing more than that. And like you've just found out all this private stuff about them. So where do humans fit? And by every measure, some of our genetic diseases, the degree of difference between the average male human and female human in life expectancy, body mass, lung capacity, width of nostrils, all of that, sperm levels in the testes, all these things that are functions of that, by every one of those measures, we're about halfway in between. We're not a pair bonding species and we're not a tournament species. We're halfway in between, and that was part of what made us generalists. So on the average, we're that. And what's also clear is amid that average of us being halfway in between and confused a whole lot of the time, and basically that explains, half of Earth's poets and all of Earth's divorce lawyers, the fact that we're confused some way halfway in between, is that individuals are not always halfway in between. They're skewed way out on one end or the other. There's gene profiles related to hormones like vasopressin and oxytocin and their receptors, which are significant contributors to how stable and fidelious, whatever the word, how faithful somebody is in their relationships, how close of interpersonal space they stand in front of somebody of the opposite sex if they're heterosexual while they're already in a relationship. Like that lines of it. So we're this species where we don't fall into any of those patterns easily. And thus we're on some fairly thin ice in saying, in this regard, we're just much more chimpish than we're bonobo-ish or whatever. We're highly variable, and we, by definition, are the species that doesn't fit into any of those categories. And when you look at the individuals amongst us, none of them fit into what the average is for our species.
Yeah,